What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan, and today I'm going to tell you why you should never trust an engineer ever. Have you ever have you ever noticed when you see like a blog post or like a YouTube video or something, and it's got an expert, big square quotes, and they claim to have disproved evolution or climate change or something like that? Isn't it weird how that person always seems to be an engineer? If you've noticed that, you're not alone. In fact, it's come up so often that it even has its own entry in the Rational Wiki, which is a wretched hive of scum and villainy nobody should actually use as a source.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
But this is in there. So this has been called the Salem Hypothesis. That's the entry on the wiki. So, what's the deal with this? And much more importantly, how should we as skeptics respond when we see someone who has expertise in one field or one topic when that person is providing expertise in a completely different field? Like, is that okay? Should we trust them? After all, maybe those engineers are all right. And those stupid scientists with their stupid science degrees and stupid education and stupid years of experience studying that specific field, maybe they're wrong, right? So, let's dive right in. The Salem Hypothesis. It gets its name from a person who coined it, a guy named Bruce Salem. And he noticed that people who posted creationist talking points on Talk Origins, people who did that while claiming to have scientific credentials, they tended to be engineers. And this is, well, anecdotal. It's not data. I don't have good statistics on this. I can say that matches my own experience and that of scientists and other science communicators that I know. So again, I haven't been able to find any good data. Like, do engineers talk crazy stuff more often than non-engineers? Isn't really an active field of research. Maybe this is all in our heads. Perhaps it might be that there are just like a lot more engineers than other sciency like adjacent fields. So if someone's going to make a contrarian claim while claiming expertise in a technical specialty, they are just likely to be an engineer. It could also be that there's a sort of bias where like people notice when someone with a veneer of expertise says something. So they might not notice if like just random Joe Blow made a claim about the climate or whatever, but it might just be that like engineers aren't more or less likely to espouse the ideas, but people will notice because, oh, he's an engineer, he must know what he's talking about. They're perceived as better informed or whatever. Now, whether this effect is real, like engineers are actually more likely to spout off nonsense about stuff they don't know, or whether it's the product of some sort of bias, I think the root cause is kind of related either way. Engineers tend to be seen as like a professional smart person by those around them. I run into this in my own life. I'm a nuclear engineer, but I also do side work in cost estimation, which was a previous career from a long time ago, and I do that as like a side gig. And when I took on this side gig, the guy who hired me, he was super excited to introduce me to the executives of his company to show off like the new expert they just acquired. Now, when he introduced me, he didn't talk about the many years of experience I had. And this is a very specific niche work. Like this is a very, very small field, and I have a lot of experience in it, which is rare. And he didn't talk about any of that. Instead, he proudly declared that they had a nuclear engineer on staff. And there's, you're a nuclear engineer. All these executives are very impressed, despite my nuclear engineering degree having exactly nothing to do with what I was hired to do, right? So what you have with engineers are a group of people who are usually pretty intelligent. Not always. There are dumb engineers, and I have met and went to school with some of them. But you have this group of people who are usually intelligent, but more importantly, they are perceived by those around them as just being wicked smart, right? Super smart people. And they also, engineers tend to see themselves as like somewhat elite because they went through this tough program to get their title. And so that combination of like generally being, reasonably intelligent, but being perceived as like super intelligent and also having the self perception of being the best of the best, that's a combination that can lead to the sort of arrogance it takes to make you think that you know better than the experts in their own field, right?
Hi there. Is there a project you're working on?
I know more than you.
All right.
But regardless of what's driving this, the Salem effect, the Salem hypothesis, this kind of behavior isn't limited to just engineers, even though they are very numerous. Lots of very smart people can be wrong when they leave their field of expertise. So I talked to some of my scientist friends to get examples from their own fields, and they had no shortage. They were immediately rattling them off. This is something they've observed. So, for example, Carey Mullis was a biochemist, won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. He invented PCR. It's a technique, got a Nobel Prize for it. Obviously, a very smart person. Also denied humanity's role in climate change, and he denied that HIV caused AIDS. Right? John Quasar, physicist, another Nobel laureate, obviously very smart, known for his work in quantum mechanics. Kind of a trend. He also denied humanity's role in climate change. R.A. Fisher was a statistician, and he's regarded as like a genius who essentially like invented modern statistics. Just like a really, really like once in a generation kind of mind. And also thought that tobacco didn't cause cancer. And he was also a eugenicist, but he lived around the 20th, like the turn of the century. So like racism was kind of the thing then. So like him being a eugenicist isn't that crazy. I don't know what his stance on climate change was, but I'm guessing if he was around today, he would have denied that too. And if you want a more like recent example, Richard Dawkins, biologist, prominent atheist, also a huge bigot. He's known for his science communication. He's done biology, but he's like a transphobe, and he seems to be going for like the speed record of cringe. So, and also if you just want to like a run of the mill example, see every nurse, paramedic, etc. during the pandemic who is suddenly an expert on vaccines because they give IVs or whatever. And this isn't a new phenomenon. This isn't like all these people are from the past century or so, but Isaac Newton, pretty well known guy, got hit on the head by an apple one time. He was into some wild stuff like alchemy, deciphering secret messages in the Bible. Like that guy was into some cuckoo bananas stuff. So this is not just an engineer thing. Lots of smart people do this when they stray outside their fields. But like up until now, I've basically assumed that's a bad thing. But like, is it a bad thing? Maybe an outside perspective is just what those scientists need to crack the case, right? Maybe that's who we need to shake things up. And you aren't necessarily wrong if you were thinking that, imaginary person who I'm talking to. Uh, that has happened. There have been instances where people have contributed to things that are well outside their field. For example, amateur climatologist and steam engineer Guy Callender published, maybe Guy Calendar, probably Guy Calendar, published papers describing how CO2 impacted the atmosphere. And at the time, his work was met with skepticism from the people who were experts in that thing. But he persuaded the experts of his day, though he might be dismayed to learn that now random people on the internet think he's full of BS, and apparently Nobel laureates too. For another example outside of science, a friend of the channel, Chrissy Hansen, regularly publishes her work on New Testament history. Her work is well regarded, but she doesn't currently have any formal qualifications in that field. But she publishes research in peer-reviewed journals all the time, so she would be a layperson, but now is regarded as an expert in that. So it's not like people who are outside the field can't contribute to it. But here's the thing. The reason instances like that are noteworthy is precisely because they're rare. It's just the nature of human knowledge these days that to be a true, like bleeding edge expert in anything, you have to devote years of study and you have to specialize. So and it's not just like you can't be a specialist in biology. Like you can get training in biology. Every biologist is going to understand biology to a certain much higher level than I do, but they're not going to understand, or they're not going to fully understand or be fully versed in every subfield. So like even a trained, like credentialed physicist, for example, doesn't know everything there's to know about physics, right? You have particle physics, and you have physics who specialize in string theory, and you have physicists who specialize in general relativity, and like all their different kinds of little niches, right? And to make truly groundbreaking discoveries, you usually have to be on that bleeding edge because that's where the new knowledge is being discovered, right? A person who spent decades learning about a specific topic makes discovery on that specific topic, though that doesn't make a gripping story, even though that's like almost always what happens. So, as a result, when the consensus, and that means the overwhelming majority of people, when the consensus of experts say a thing is true and a layperson says they're wrong, the experts are usually right because they had to spend all this time getting there. And this is just trivially true. Like, this should be obvious. When you have heart problems or you think you're sick, you go to your doctor, not a plumber, because the doctor is an expert. And if the doctor tells you something and the plumber tells you something different, the doctor is probably right. So, this by itself should be a compelling reason to listen to experts most of the time. If we want to hold true beliefs and not false ones, you can do worse than just believing what the consensus of experts think about their field, right? You'll be right more often than you'll be wrong. So that's kind of like a heuristic. But hey, just because people outside the field are usually wrong, like if a layperson opines they're usually wrong, that doesn't mean they're always wrong, right? And there doesn't mean they're wrong in this specific instance. So maybe we shouldn't gatekeep science. Like what matters is their evidence and their arguments, not the credentials. So shouldn't we instead just see what they have to say and make determinations based on that on what they're saying, right? Based just look at the evidence, look at the arguments, and assess it regardless of who the source is. And in a sense, this isn't wrong. Ultimately, whether someone is an expert, whether they have credentials, whether they studied it, that doesn't change what their arguments are or what their evidence is. It doesn't, in and of itself, make their arguments better. So, in a perfect world, we would do exactly that. We would look at the arguments, we would look at the evidence purely on their own merits and assess it and come to a conclusion based on that. But we don't live in that perfect world. So there's some problems with that approach. And the first problem is that you, regardless of what the other person is, regardless of whether or not they're an expert, it's a virtual certainty that you're not an expert in whatever field it is you're looking at because you're not going to be an expert in most things. And it can be very difficult for non experts to tell the difference between a good argument and a good sounding argument in a field they don't know about without help from the field's experts. So, to give you an example, what this might look like, here's a dumbed down hypothetical from something I have a very slight expertise in, nuclear power. I'm a nuclear engineer. So suppose you, as a skeptic, heard someone make this claim. Hey, listen, nuclear power plants that are currently running, they are running off designs that were made in like the 70s, super old. And those super old designs were very conservative. They were super safe, maybe too safe. They had a lot of extra stuff baked in. But my brand new design is going to fix all that. I can get way more energy out of the same amount of fuel, same amount of uranium. I'm going to do that by changing the geometry, the shape of the fuel rods. They're currently in these cylinders, like there's these little pellets that are, cylinders. I'm going to change that to a hexagon, a hexagonal shape. And that's going to let me pack them in much tighter. Like when you try to pack cylinders, there's lots of gaps. So hexagonal fuel pellets going to eliminate those gaps. And that's going to make a more efficient core. And a more efficient core means lower cost, right? It's also going to reduce costs and make the core safer by changing the materials we pack those pellets into. So they are in a big long tube, and that tube is currently made out of a zirconium alloy. And that's very expensive, but also at very high temperatures, the kind you'd get in an accident, that zirconium can interact with water and produces hydrogen gas. And sometimes that gas explodes. That's what happened at Fukushima. So instead of using this like way over engineered, like super expensive material that has that huge flaw, I'm going to use stainless steel, just plain old stainless steel, much cheaper, and it won't release hydrogen. So it's going to be safer. You want to invest? So that's the pitch. And if you don't know much about nuclear power, that might sound reasonable. You might know just from existing that power plants tend to be old. And of course, we've got better tech now than they did in the 70s. And you also know that cylinders are stupid and hexes are better. And if you're kind of more well informed on this topic, you might even remember that, hey, Fukushima did have a hydrogen explosion that had something to do with the fuel rods. So, like, to a casual non expert, that might all sound pretty plausible. But if you know a little more about the topic, you'd be able to, see that packing in more fuel pellets because they're a hexagon, that's nonsense. That's crazy. Because if you pack the fuel too tightly, it would make it difficult, if not impossible, to control the reaction. The problem is not that you actually have to take reactivity out of the reactor in order to run in a sustainable way. And also, the fuel rods have to be spaced out so you can get coolant through there to take the heat away. The heat is what we use to generate electricity. And so, like, packing them in tighter wouldn't help. And also the hexagonal fuel, because it's like corners, it would be more prone to melting because the heat wouldn't be evenly distributed. So yeah, lots wrong with that. In fact, there's more wrong with that pitch. Bonus points to you if you can comment down below and tell me other things that are wrong. But the point is that that whole spiel could sound plausible to someone who doesn't know any better. And, it's not your fault you don't know better. Why should you know the details of a nuclear reactor? But therein lies the problem. We can't be experts in everything. It's impossible for us to be sufficiently well informed to be able to understand and vet every single claim we encounter all on our own without any help from people who better understand the topic. Not only is there insufficient time for it, like insufficient time to dedicate yourself to become sufficiently well informed to do that, but let's face it, not everybody is even capable of being an expert in fields. Like, no matter how much time I dedicate to it, and I'm a pretty smart guy, I am never going to fully understand electrical engineering because it is magic, and you'll never convince me it is otherwise. So it literally wouldn't matter how much time and energy I spent trying to understand it. I'm not going to. And so at the same time, though, so while we can't be experts, we still have to make decisions. We as skeptics, we want to hold true beliefs. We want to not hold false ones. So that means we're going to have to make decisions based on our understanding of fields that we aren't experts in. So what do we do in that case? Well, for starters, you have to accept that this is the case, that you can't always assess the evidence directly by yourself, and that's okay. It's not cheating. It doesn't make you a bad skeptic to acknowledge that. In fact, acknowledging your limitations and seeking the assistance of experts in a field that you aren't familiar with, that's good skepticism because that's going to be more likely to lead you to good results. So, because we won't be able to assess this evidence ourselves, at some point you're going to have to go see what the experts say. Okay, so you want to be a good skeptic. You're trying to filter through all this information. Sometimes you're going to need to apply heuristics to kind of do the bulk filtering process because you're going to hear a lot of claims that you're going to have a lot of evidence coming at you, and you don't have time to parse through in a detailed manner everything. So here's some like simple rules you can apply that'll help filter out like the large swaths of nonsense. So you can kind of use it as a first pass and then dive down on the stuff that kind of remains. The first question to ask yourself: this information you're getting, this claim you're getting, is this claim peer reviewed? Was this published in a peer reviewed journal? Note, I don't mean it was checked by peers. That's not peer review. Peer review is a formal process publishing in journals that have standards. You can read up on peer review elsewhere. Peer review does not mean it's correct. Just because something is peer reviewed does not mean it is accurate. But what it does mean is that some people who are experts in that field looked at this thing and thought it was reasonable enough to warrant publishing. Even if they didn't agree with it personally, it had to pass some level of scrutiny to get there. Uh, this is a large quality hurdle that can help like immediately filter out a whole bunch of nonsense. As long as you make sure you go to good sources, you can look for things like some red flags are it's a open source journal. Not all open source journals are bad. There are good ones, but there are also open source journals which are basically pay to publish and they're like predatory, so they don't have a good reputation. You can kind of look to see how they're regarded in the field. You can see how high their impact factor is. Higher impact factor just means that other people cite it and talk about it a lot. So there's kind of quality checks you can do to see if it's peer reviewed. But anyway, if you're looking at a news source, like a news article or something, obviously that's not going to be peer reviewed, right? But they're going to be referencing something. Is that something they're referencing? Is their source peer reviewed? Did they list their citations? If they didn't list their citation, that's a red flag. But if they did, go glance at the citation. Are they accurately telling you what the citation says? Often, when there's like a big thing of research that comes out, you can often get a press release or something from the organization that did the research that is like geared at explaining their research to the layperson. And they, because they aren't like being driven by clicks in the same way that journalists often are, it might be less sensational. So you can kind of check them that way. Okay, so let's say they are peer reviewed, or maybe it's like an expert giving his opinion. Is that expert actually an expert? So this is rule number 2. Is that expert really an expert in the thing? Is it someone who's trained in the field? If they have, do they have credentials? Do they have relevant experience? This can be harder than it looks. I've kind of been assuming that you can just like tell when someone's an expert, but tons of people pretend to be experts that aren't. I know that Dr. So and so, they're wearing a lab coat. Obviously, they're right, but like just because they're wearing a lab coat doesn't mean they know the medicine stuff, right? So the first thing you can do is look for a bow tie. Someone's wearing a bow tie, particularly if they're wearing it with a t-shirt, they can be trusted, but not everyone wears their like expertise on the sleeve like that. So If you want another way to kind of check, you might think you can just go off like their titles, but even that is tricky because you might not like know what title necessarily confers expertise. Like you might think a nurse would be an expert in vaccines. After all, they administer them. It's medicine. That doesn't make them qualified or informed to go into the development or testing of it. So rule number 2 is check if this person's actually an expert, but that can sometimes be tricky, right? And so that leads me to rule number 3. What does the consensus of experts say? Right? What does the field as a whole say? Every field will have weirdos. Like there are creationists who are credentialed, they're bona fide, that like the physicists or biologists who still accept young Earth creationism, but they're like the 0.01%. So instead, look at what is the large majority of people in this field. What do they say about it? If the large, so consensus doesn't mean just a couple people, like the vast and overwhelming majority of people, if they say a thing is true, that doesn't mean that the thing is true necessarily, but it does mean that a majority of people who have spent their lives investigating this topic think it's true. They have been convinced and they are going to be right more often than they are wrong. So if you're going to guess, you're going to be less accurate with your uninformed guess than the consensus of experts is. Now, what is the consensus can sometimes be hard to assess because they don't necessarily do a poll, right? That's not how it's done. So what you can do is you can look at like organizations in the field to get kind of like a proxy feel. So with vaccines, for example, if Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic and all these professional organizations of doctors, if they're all saying vaccines are safe, but Joe Blow, Doctor So and So, the chiropractor says it's not, well, you should wait Joe Blow's, Doctor Joe Blow's. Sorry, don't want to offend this chiropractor, this imaginary one. You wait his testimony a little lower, right? So the key point here is not that the consensus is always right. This is not an argument from authority. I am not saying an authority said it, therefore it is correct. What I am saying is a large proportion of the authorities said it, and they are usually right. So if you find yourself coming to a conclusion that they're wrong, if you find yourself being persuaded of that, you should stop and ask, well, hold on, what's more likely? Is it more likely that I, some random but exceptionally well dressed skeptic, am right and everyone who has spent like orders of magnitude more time looking at this than I have and they're all wrong? Or is it that they just know something I don't? That second one's like more likely, right? So go find out what that is. Now, if you ask yourselves these questions, those 3 kind of rules, and you apply those, you will filter out with not very much effort a lot of nonsense that would otherwise seem very persuasive. You may not necessarily reject just because it fails a rule, doesn't mean it's wrong. You may not reject it because it failed one of the criteria, but that does mean you should be more skeptical. You should dig deeper. You should need more evidence to be convinced because this is kind of like a probability thing. If the consensus of experts is like 70% likely to be right, well, then you need more evidence to overcome that imbalance. So this can help kind of prioritize where you spend your time, and that's really the value of it. You only have limited time, you only have limited expertise to like dive into things. You can't dive into everything deeply, so this can kind of prioritize and sift through the worst of it, and then you can spend more time if you feel so inclined to dig into the better ones, right? So hopefully these rules help you be a better skeptic and give you the time and tools you need to assess claims that you encounter. Uh, if you encounter a claim from an engineer, if you take nothing else away, uh, engineers talking in technical fields are very often wrong. Being an engineer does not grant you expertise in anything that's not engineering. Being a physicist doesn't grant you expertise in things that aren't physics. So if you see physicist so and so talking about biology, well, just know that physicist so and so is no more qualified to talk about biology than anybody else is, right? Doesn't like all it just means is some random guy thought something. Maybe that random guy's wrong. Okay, so that's the video. That's the stuff we had to go over. So since you made it to the end, it is time for the bad argument of the day. And today's bad argument comes to you from every creationist ever. It is science has been wrong before. So how do you know it's not wrong now? How do you know it's right now? It's just going to change its mind tomorrow. So like, why trust it? This is often employed to try to dismiss like a scientific theory or whatever, like peer reviewed evidence you just pointed at. to dismiss that and say, well, because it changes all the time, you can't trust it. So therefore, it's incorrect. And in a way, they're not exactly wrong because science does change all the time. But the thing is, that's not a bug. That's a feature. That's a good thing because as we get more evidence, as we get more information, we want to change our mind in light of this new information, right? And science is self correcting for all of its flaws. It's not perfect. The methodology that scientists use, it's made so that good ideas win out over time and bad ideas are winnowed out. If they just don't make accurate predictions, eventually they will lose out and the better ideas will rise to the top. Now, I think this idea that science changes all the time, I think that's kind of mistaken mindset. View science as like when it changes, is like every few years they just throw it out. They just completely 180 change their minds completely. The new theory has nothing to do with the old theory, just flip flopping all the time, and that's not what it looks like. I find it more. I find it better to think instead of like science changing the mind. Instead, science is the process by which we become less wrong over time. So we were wrong yesterday. We're still wrong today, but we're not as wrong as we were. Theories that are held as accurate, they are like believed precisely because they make good predictions. Like you see it predicts if you see A, B, and C, then it predicts D is the next thing you're going to see. And we check it over and over again, and D comes up all the time, right? That's why we believe the theory in the first place. So when a new theory comes along and replaces that old one, it must make the same predictions as the old one did when the old one was right. And this makes sense because the evidence hasn't changed. There were just some things we didn't understand before. So, as an example, when Newton proposed his laws of motion, and his various Newtonian physics, it was really good at describing the world around us. In fact, it's so good that we still use it to this day, even though we know it's wrong. It's still good enough to get us to the moon, right? So it's still like pretty good. But eventually, there was some stuff that like it didn't fit, didn't quite fit with what Newton said science, like the reality should be. And then Einstein came along and he made a better theory. His theories of general relativity made new predictions that were more accurate, but vitally, it made identical predictions to Newton in the areas where Newton was right. And it had to do that. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't work, right? So this is what is meant by changing. It's just because it's making the model more accurate, but it's not throwing out the old model completely. To put it more succinctly, people used to think the world was flat. Then they thought the world was like perfectly spherical. Then they found that it's kind of like a lumpy oblate spheroid. But so like the flat earthers and like the perfectly spherical earthers, they were both wrong. But the spherical earthers were way less wrong than the flat earthers, right? So that's the bad argument of the day. Now, we shared some rules, or I shared some rules, the royal we. I shared some rules to help you think about skepticism, but like rules are boring and they're tough and they take energy. And why do that? If you want some faster, surefire, low effort way to be a better skeptic, what you can do is like this video and subscribe to this channel. Studies have shown that subscribers to this channel are 64.5% less likely to perform bad skepticism. So if you want to be an instant good skeptic, do that. If you want to supercharge that power, you can join our Patreon. You not only become an amazing skeptic, you also get early access to videos like this one right here. So do all that, do the YouTube stuff. And after you've done that, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.